of course, it's going to be different for everybody. But I think for a lot of people that find themselves in a similar situation to where we were, anxiety or fear takes everything.
Yes.
I would actually make a point of arguing that potentially fear is the biggest inhibitor when it comes to a lot of mental health conditions.
I probably would agree with that in its entirety, to be perfectly fair. When you're thinking about whatever you're doing in terms of maybe working on your career or even working on your mental health, there is the fear of the unknown.
Mm,
And that is an element of anxiety, isn't it? It's something with a fear of what's going to happen, and that's when sometimes we can do things that we kind of self sabotage ourselves in many respects.
that's exactly it. We
Yeah.
can, yeah, find ourselves, and this is something that my father once said to me, and I didn't like it at the time, but I've come to see it as true. We can become our own worst enemies,
Yes.
can't we? I think that's the fundamental thing here. So we've got a comment that's coming up. I'm not capable. That's the point. I just feel embarrassed myself all the time, so I don't bother. And thank you for contributing that, Tina. I really appreciate your sincerity on that. I know it's a really hard thing to share. And what you're bringing in here is that you've got a very fixed belief, which we have to recognize is your opinion, and it's
Yep.
formed through different conditioning, different life events that you've had, that you don't feel capable. If you really truly believe that you don't feel capable, naturally, when we go into situations where we don't feel capable, we'll start to feel some emotion. We might feel like we haven't achieved the things that we set out to. We feel embarrassed. And then a lot of the time, we will project our own feelings
Yes.
onto other people and assume that because we're feeling this way, they too must see that we've embarrassed ourselves
Yes.
in this case here.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest danger that we can start to talk about. And it's through nobody's fault. It's a perfectly natural place to go. But if we don't feel that we're capable, we don't bother.
Well, I was just going to go back to Tina's comment there when, in terms of, like Charlie is saying, if you go into any kind of situations feeling you're not capable, then the outcome invariably is that you will come across stumbling blocks. And it can, if we don't kind of work our way through this kind of stuff, almost rubber stamp a self belief that you have. And if you've had that self belief for a long, long period of time, it's really difficult to start challenging things like that because, in lots of situations that I had, I struggled thinking that I wasn't capable. But when I started to push it, then I started to realize that I was capable. And the one thing that I wanted to point out, which was part of that comment, is so I don't bother. And that's where sometimes we can find that we kind of self sabotage effectively because you're going to try something, you feel you're not capable, you're kind of listening to that and taking that as 100% truth. So you don't bother doing anything about it. And, when we work, especially here at Isorropia, we try and develop the fact that if you don't actually try and do something, then you are actually going to continue on that line of you don't think you're capable.
That's it.
There's been many situations, Charlie, where, I myself and probably you, is you feel that you're not capable of doing something, then you do it. And that sense of reward that you get at the end, and it might be that it didn't go well. It might be that you might have mixed up your words or something simple, but you've given it a go. And after a period of time, you'll find that you'll be willing to give something a go. And then that starts to build self esteem, confidence. And then it starts to build your mindset saying, I might not be good at this, but I'm going to give it a go rather than I'm not capable of doing this.
That's it. And it's a difficult one because what you're talking about there is a moment in time that a lot of us will have where we have that almost there's a decision to make where
Yes.
we realize that we've been stuck in the same pattern for a long time, perhaps the same beliefs as you're sharing there, Tina. And I know this is something that I certainly felt for a long time as well. But we get to a point where we're left with two choices. We can either continue with the way that we've been feeling about a certain thing and stay in that mindset, but a lot of us can find that we get bored, tired, frustrated, exhausted, and we get this sense that something needs to change.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, it's a perfectly natural place for us to be. But in order for us to start to make some of those changes, like you were saying, take that action, we need to create a space of uncertainty in our own mind. I know that sounds spooky in itself, but what I'm saying here is that although we might have a fixed belief about not being capable, not being worthwhile, not being lovable, so many of the beliefs that we hear talked about regularly here,
Mhm.
we have to create almost a little space of uncertainty for the idea that although this has held true for us in the past and that's how we feel, we might be wrong. And in that uncertainty, we have to learn to take steps to start to create evidence almost for us to change it. But fundamentally, fear is one of the things that will stop us from doing that.
There's a phrase that I use quite regularly, and I learnt this across my journey. Is when you have kind of fear and stuff, it's a momentary feeling, a feeling of fear. Yeah. So sometimes, I mean, I remember this vividly. Is And the phrase I'll use it is you have to start thinking about being comfortable with feeling uncomfortable because it's very momentarily.
Mhm.
It's almost like a moment in time. But if you can kind of be comfortable feeling that sense of anxiety, feeling that sense, and kind of guiding your way through it, it's so much easier. So that's all I can really say about that. Sometimes we get fearful, we get worried about things, and then we kind of just can't take that last thing. But then it only takes a moment, quite a moment, when you can come away from those situations and think things like, do you know, I wish I took the plunge. Do you know, I wish I really did try that. I didn't push myself enough. And that's when I just use that phrase. Sometimes you have to take that uncomfortability because it will pass really quickly.
Mm.
And then once you start to get comfortable with that, then you can start building on actually making changes because you know that you're going to feel uncomfortable for a period of time.
That's true. It's the place that we need to get to. So, talking about, almost as that unshakable moment in time, isn't there, where we make a decision that we have to learn to
Mm,
start to feel comfortable with the uncomfortability.
mhm.
What is the end goal? And I think this leads us nicely onto the next question, which is one that I wanted to have a look at, which simply asks, what is your definition of recovery or wellness? And the reason I ask this is because a lot of the time we can start to set up a goal so far away in our own minds, and it might feel so unattainable that that can dissuade us in the first place for even trying to take some of the steps towards improving our mental well-being. I'm going to start off with a quick definition. And the process of recovery is simply defined as the ongoing process of regaining control over your life after mental health issues. And I think that this is the thing that we need to establish. What we're talking about here, recovery, wellness, it isn't a million miles away. It's actually a lot of the time it's something that just takes a few more small
Yes.
tweaks rather for us to do to start to implement to get to that place. I know that I've asked this question of ourselves and we'll discuss it, but for anybody that's watching, for anyone that feels comfortable in sharing, I would love if you would be happy to share some of your definitions of what it even means to be well in the first place. Um, I don't know about you, Neil, but when I was unwell,
Hmm.
I had a very fixed, I'm going to say disillusional idea almost of what it meant for me to be well. Did you share in that at all?
Yes, I did.
Yeah,
Most definitely.
is there anything that you recognise perhaps that might have been a bit removed from the reality of it?
Well, it's quite a interesting question, and it'd be nice to get some feedback here
Mm,
because my definition of wellness was to live a happy and fruitful life. But I didn't really understand what that was.
mm,
And it's a really interesting point that Charlie's made in the fact that when I started to kind of work on getting an understanding about my mental health concerns, it was only it was kind of pinpointed. There was only some small little tweaks that put me on the right kind of pathway to actually get the things that I needed to actually get to wellness. Now, wellness for me, yeah, is I just need to be well for myself and manage myself effectively. And then I found myself being able to integrate myself back into the big wide world because I had that sense of just calm um, in myself. And then it started to build that I'm comfortable with being me and I'm comfortable with maybe taking the plunge from time to time. So I often get asked that question, what was my definition of wellness? Um, and looking back in hindsight, I didn't quite understand what wellness was, because that's a very individual thing. Wouldn't you
Hugely,
agree?
hugely subjective and
You know,
individual.
everybody definition of wellness will be completely different,
Mhm.
which is why we at Isorropia here, we work on the kind of person-centered approach, because wellness to Charlie is completely different to wellness for Neil.
Mm. That's exactly it. And each of us is going to carry around our own definitions. And I think the first thing that we want to do in order for us to actually start to become well is to really pay attention to the goals that we're setting ourselves.
Yeah.
And this is something that I carried for a long time. My definition of wellness, just to give it really quickly, was that I needed to be defined by my social status. I needed to be the life of the party wherever it is that I was going. I needed to have an awful lot of money in my bank account. I was very financially driven and also career driven as well. And when you're feeling incredibly low, when you feel, that you're disconnected from all your friends, your family, whatever it may be, that sometimes that can feel completely unreachable. And actually, one of the first points of me starting to turn the corner, if you will, was when I started to talk to Vicky Howarth, the CEO of Isorropia, and we were discussing, what it is that I needed or wanted to do. And she was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, there, Charlie. You're describing something that's completely unrealistic, completely unattainable, and more so to that, it's not going to make you happy."
Yes.
It's not going to make you happy, she
Yeah.
said. And that was a huge moment of pause and reflection for me. If I think of the difference now in the definition that I've got before I started this work,
Mm.
one was very driven about my social status, finances. Where I'm at now is that wellness for me can be defined by just four elements. And these are just four elements that are personal to me. Number one, I know that I'm well if I'm swimming. Get all the endorphins. I get to feel a bit of pride in myself after the event. It keeps me in shape as well, which is important. I feel that I'm well if I'm looking after myself, self care, coming to work. The third one, if I'm socializing, I know that's a good sign. That makes me feel well. And then the final one as well is always I'm quite a keen learner, I would say, and I
Mm.
like to have
Yeah.
kind of a mental challenge. And as long as I'm learning something, I feel well. Ultimately, wellness isn't something that's going to be defined by your social status in life.
No.
And for me, talking back to that definition, the ongoing process of regaining control over your life, wellness isn't to be defined by avoiding low mood. It isn't by avoiding our emotions. I'm afraid to say we're human. That's part and parcel of our existence. They're always going to be there, but it is that process of regaining some element of control. So it's no longer hijacking you, no longer affecting your life. That fear, in the case of what we're talking here, is no longer governing the way that you act. And wellness, with it being ongoing, is just having bigger and bigger periods of feeling content,
Yep.
peace of mind, a bit of bliss. And those areas where we find that we're struggling, those moments in time, just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. There's nothing more to it than that. Sounds simple.
It does. Yeah.
Well, simpler. It's
Simpler.
simpler.
Yeah.
We'll settle on simpler. I think that sounds good to me. So we have wellness for me is accepting and regaining control of the controllables. That I am enough. I
Wow. That's
absolutely love that.
brilliant.
I'm glad you're loving that as
That
well.
is brilliant.
It's amazing, isn't it? So wellness for me is accepting. So one, an acceptance of our reality,
Yeah.
perhaps an acceptance of the things that have happened in the past. And I love that regaining control of the controllables, the things that we do
I couldn't
have in
have
our
put
power.
that better
It's
myself.
beautiful. In fact,
It's absolutely fantastic, and that's one key thing that that really stood out for me is regaining control of the controllables.
mm,
Because sometimes when we're kind of not, you know, we're in an unwell place, we tend to find sometimes, do we not, that we try and control things that are completely out of our control. You know, in terms of things like anxiety, it's almost like we try and control things that are just uncontrollable. We can't change the weather, for instance, but sometimes when you're highly anxious, it can create emotions, if that's making sense.
it's true.
You can't control that it's going to snow one day, and it knocks you off kilter with your plans, and then you start to feel sad about it, and you feel like you're moving towards, that emotion that makes you sad, and then something else will come along that's out of your control and make you more sadder.
Uh,
But then, I love the fact that regaining control of the controllables is just a perfect phrase for me.
it isn't, with your permission, Ruth. we'll steal that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
That is absolutely, it's an amazing definition. And what you're alluding to there, and what Ruth is surely talking about as well, is that so much of our mental struggles can come from when we're putting so much of our focus and attention on areas, like you say, that we can't possibly influence. You
Mm,
mentioned the weather. Politics is something that I've seen people
yeah.
get really caught up and really irate about, something that we have very limited control over. War being another one, but we have to reflect on the things that we can control. We can, to an element, control some of our thinking. We can choose where we're putting our attention and focus. Is it on the negative? Is it on that anxiety inducing thought? Or are we making a deliberate effort to change our thought patterns? We can start to turn to our behaviors, our routines, the things that we do, the people we socialize with. There are so many things that we do have a degree of control over. And although it might not feel it at the time, we do. And it's just that ongoing process, regaining control. And the last thing I want to highlight, I am enough. That is our mantra. One of our mantras here at Isorropia. Everybody is enough. And it is our duty to convince ourselves of that, because I can guarantee you that everybody else sees it. But it's always with ourselves.
Yeah.
Just need to show it to ourselves. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ruth. I really, really appreciated that comment.
It's a great comment, Ruth.
Brilliant. So, should we have a look at the next comment or question? We have, what kind of fears can hold you back? And this is one that you've actually alluded to, Neil. You talked about fear of the unknown.
Mm,
Yeah. And I think that that's probably one that we're going to have to acknowledge today. This might be an oversimplification. Some people might disagree with it, or some people might agree with it entirely. But when it comes to identifying fears, the way that I've always done it is I've put them into two categories for myself. We have the fear of the unknown,
mhm,
which is a huge element of what can hold us back as
mhm.
well. But off the back of that as well, we also have the fear of what I just call repeated mistakes.
Yes.
And that kind of alludes to the fears that we can have based off the past experiences that we've had, based off of our conditioning. So I'm just going to share a real brief example here. For me, I used to have a very, very big fear around public speaking. I'm hoping that no one would guess that here today. But the reason I had that fear is because when I was in high school, I was asked to do a debate in front of the classroom. And I won't give you the whole story, but in short, I froze during the debate in front of all of my classmates. My anxiety kicked in. I went into that freeze mode. I stopped being able to speak. My mind went blank. And from that moment in time, I had realized, or I formed my own belief, that I was incapable of being able to speak in front of groups of people. So what that meant for me is that going forward, whenever there was the opportunity to do public speaking or to talk in front of even just large groups of friends,
Mhm.
I would shy away because of that repeated mistake, or that mistake that I'd had, projecting it onto my future, and then suddenly the elements of the past that have affected me are coming at me from the
Into the
future.
future.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly how you put it. I like the way you said you're projecting things and you're kind of creating your own future, and that's a really important thing. It's creating our own future is making changes where things need to be changed.
Mm.
But the experience that Charlie had there, I had very much the same kind of experience, Charlie, where I went to a party once, and because it wasn't the kind of people that I would normally integrate with, I didn't share the same kind of things that they enjoyed doing.
Mm.
But I thought that I just would get involved in that conversation because I wanted to be around social people. And I kind of came away from that with the fact, or my inner narrative was telling me, I'm not good in social circles anymore. I was obviously particularly good in social circles, but it was that one defined moment
Mm.
that then what I did is I started to just disconnect from any kind of social connection for quite a period of time. And then in hindsight, that's probably one of the key issues. And that's because I was projecting something from the past and allowing it to define my future. So it's a really interesting point. I love the way you put that.
Yeah, good. I'm really glad that you did, and I think this is something that a lot of us are going to recognize in ourselves as well. Is that that fear we have experiences a little bit like Tina was alluding to earlier.
Mm,
Very fixed belief of not being capable. I would be willing to place a fair amount of money on that. That it's something that has been proven from Tina's past experiences, a lot of our past experiences, and then we just make that a reality for ourselves.
absolutely.
The consequences when we have that anxiety we project into the future, it starts to dictate the way that we behave. And we then start to create almost our own self fulfilling prophecies where we walk this path, where we continue to act in a way that actually validates the way that we feel. And it's just a constant narrative, isn't it, of reconfirmation, validation for some really unhelpful, distorted beliefs.
Yes,
And that's the
absolutely.
that's the ultimate trap. I think it's important to discuss as well the fear of the unknown, because the fear of the unknown is something that is inescapable. It is something that I would argue is hardwired into us. And that's because fundamentally anxiety does serve to protect us ultimately. All of our emotions exist for a reason, but anxiety in particular is designed to protect us and to help us survive. That is its fundamental
Yeah,
purpose. And of course, if we're going into an unknown situation, something that we haven't experienced, we're going to naturally feel anxiety because we have no idea what we're going into. We don't know the people there, we don't know the variables, and there's a little part of us, a real primal part, that actually doesn't know if there's going to be a threat coming around the
absolutely.
corner.
Yeah, I agree.
So we have to acknowledge that as well.
Totally agree.
And I know for a fact this is still a fear that I face on a, I wouldn't say a daily basis because I don't know too much that's unknown to me. But if I'm going into a new situation, I would always have that kind of natural anxiety as well. So I think what would be good is if we have a look at either the next question or comment. And as we have a little look at that, I want everyone to reflect as well for themselves. What kind of fear is it that's holding you back? We have a comment from Wayne who says, "Past mistakes and not letting them go. I live in past more than I do in the future." And I'd like to thank you, Wayne, for that comment. And it shows an awful lot of insight. That's what it does as well. I was we've been alluding to this idea that we live in the past ultimately. Bad things happen to us, it conditions us, it affects the way that we see ourselves, and then we continue to exist in those few moments in time, acting in ways that reconfirm, reconfirm, reconfirm. And I think that this is ultimately one of the biggest traps that we can fall into
Yeah.
because naturally it's going to start to steal our hope for the future. And as you say there, Wayne, yourself as well, you live more in the past than the future. And this is, we were talking earlier about we have to make a decision that it's time to break that. When we make that decision, that's when we can start that process of empowerment again and starting to work towards the way that we want things to be rather than continuing to exist in a way that confirms the way things were. But no, I'm glad that you recognize that in yourself, Wayne. It's a really, really good comment that I think a lot of people are going to recognize in themselves as well. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I would say exactly that. I mean, just reading Wayne's comment there, that's probably where I was, probably where you were, in a lot of respects. And again, I like some analogies from time to time. But
It's good.
if we allow ourselves to kind of live in the past and define our future, then we're always going to be in that position where we're not happy or we're unwell. And then that does bring it back to the stuff that I said at the beginning. Once I got an understanding about my mental health conditions, then I found it a little bit easier, less scary to start actually facing some of those. One of the things that you mentioned in there is letting go of certain things. And I don't know if you agree with me here. That's probably one of the most difficult things that I had to kind of face and challenge, of letting go of some of the aspects of my previous past.
It has to be one of the most difficult things, and in fact, I think it's something that we should give some more attention to
Mm,
in just a moment because, of course, we are doing a fear of getting well live,
yeah.
and what we have coming up next, actually, if we move on to the next question, is some of the different blocks potentially that we can face. And this question here: what fears did you need to face on your path to wellness? I think it leads us beautifully into, like you were saying, that fear of having to let go of the way things were, of our old identities, potentially
Yeah.
to an extent, and having to gravitate away from that. So, to give everybody a heads up, we have 25 minutes left or so. And what it is that we would like to do now is to go through a few of different headers, a few different topics. And this is a list of things that our members have contributed to, but also the team have brought together to identify some of those biggest blocks that we're going to face as we
Yeah.
transition to wellness. So, as we go through this, if there is anything that you would like to add, anything that you'd like to bring to the table, talking about your own experiences, your own successes around this, or even ask questions, just do and we'll deal with it. So, the fear of leaving our identity and letting go of the past. For me, this has to be one of the hardest things. If we think back to the way that we've reconfirmed again our identities, we've been living in the past, then there has to be an element of fear around letting go of that.
Yes.
Something that I've observed a lot in myself and other people as well, is that unfortunately, as humans, we have a habit of forming all of our identities, the way that we interact with the world, the way that we socialize, the way that we deal with ourselves, off the back of our past experiences. And for a few of us, that can mean that we base our identities off either a single unfortunate event or a series of really terrible events that have happened to us in the past. What's worse is that after that, we can then find ourselves eventually getting labeled with a diagnosis. And
Yes.
diagnoses, I think, are incredibly useful in a few aspects. They give us kind of a validation for perhaps for why it is that we've been struggling. It helps to alleviate some of the blame as well. It might also help us to get the right support. But there is a danger that if we've been struggling for a long time, we've been given a diagnosis, we can start to form everything that we do around our mental illness,
Yeah.
depression, anxiety, bipolar, whatever it may be,
Yeah.
rather than our mental well-being. And there's a huge difference there. Mental illness is the past. Mental well-being is what we do going forward as well. And this is the scary thing. This is where it gets terrifying because what we're asking everybody to do individually is to introspect, to identify parts of their identity that perhaps might be holding them back and to shed them, to change them. And naturally, as we transition from the person that we were to the person that we want to be, it's going to be
It's
terrifying.
gonna, yeah,
It's
it's gonna
terrifying.
bring that fear in, isn't it?
We're asking ourselves to drop potentially a part of our personality
Yeah.
as well. And that we have to acknowledge is absolutely terrifying. I don't know if this is true for you, Neil. And there's a term that I like to talk about from time to time called romanticizing the past.
Hmm.
And romanticizing the past isn't necessarily what it sounds like, but it talks about the process that we can go through when we start to, again, build our identities around our diagnoses, potentially, all the things that have happened to us. I know for a fact that when I was struggling, I would refer to myself as depressed. I would start saying things like, I'm anxious, I am depressed, rather than I have depressive tendencies, I'm feeling worried. And all that did was keep my focus again on the things that were limiting me. I don't know if this is true for you, and I do want your feedback on this actually, but there was certainly a great deal of times as well where I found myself saying things to myself like, it's all right, I don't have to go out, I'm anxious. It's all right, I'm allowed to drink more than other people,
That
I'm
kind of
depressed.
that kind of lands with me in its entirety in the fact that I did kind of establish that I almost kind of made excuses to myself based on the fact, I suffered quite badly with depression. And, I take some strategies to alleviate that depression. And then somebody would ask me, you need, or tell me, you would need to do this, you need to do that, you need to start integrating yourself back in. And exactly like Charlie said, I can't do that because I'm anxious. And it wasn't for me because I've been on a voyage of discovery the same as yourself. It wasn't that I was anxious, I was just fearful. But every time something happened, I kind of just went back, and almost for me it was like making an excuse in my own head as to why I couldn't do something. I can't do that because it upsets me, so I'm depressed. I'm depressed. You're not actually depressed. Doing a little bit of work around it, you probably are somewhere else. It might be that you're just sad that day.
Mm.
And it's almost like we change our own narrative in our heads, don't we? And we create our own blockages.
We do. And this is the thing. And sometimes the way that we even just refer to ourselves or our opinion of the issues that we're holding in itself can be debilitating. If you find yourself saying things often or referring to yourself as depressed
Mm,
or anxious or, like I was saying, bipolar, EPD, whatever it might be, what you're doing is you're describing that it's almost like akin to a piece of the puzzle that makes you whole. And the issue is that that is really thank
debilitating.
you, debilitating. And the more that we do that, it becomes more integrated into us. And eventually we do have that realization that for us to become well in ourselves, we have to leave that behind. We have to
Mm,
take that out. And that in itself is scary. And that leaves us with a whole host of other uncertainties, which leads us on nicely to the fear of the unknown. So, we've discussed this a little bit, so I think we'll only give it perhaps just a few moments of our time. But fear of the unknown. In order for us to become well, we're going to have to start to step outside of our comfort zones, start to go into the uncomfortable,
yeah.
learn to start to feel comfortable in that. And for a lot of us, that could be something that feels completely alien,
Yeah.
especially if we don't know what it feels like or means to be well. We might start to find ourselves facing really scary existential questions. Who am I?
Mm.
What will I be able to achieve once I get well?
Yeah.
What is my potential? A few very, very scary
Scary
questions.
questions, aren't they?
And
Yes.
sometimes, rather than us taking the steps perhaps to try and answer these questions, we'll find ourselves just going back to the same patterns and same old behaviors, the things that keep us trapped in the first place.
I That's a really interesting point as well. Is kind of landed with me in terms of, I don't know, how you felt, but I never ever ever questioned myself in terms of anything. It was just almost my language was almost feeding some things that I was suffering with, because I was labeling myself as being a depressed person.
Mm,
And I never really sat down and said, what is depression in its entirety? Because there are questions that I've never asked in terms of, because that's the way I was, that's the whole reason why I'm feeling like that. But the reason why that kind of got to me was when I was going through my recovery journey, when I started to question some things that really caused me problems, anxiety, depression, disconnection, start to ask myself some questions and then got a realization around a lot of the concerns that I had were actually not real. To be
mm,
perfectly honest, they weren't real. And because I was comfortable sitting in my comfort zone, I wasn't allowing myself to maybe finding out whether that was rational, irrational, real, unreal. Is that making sense?
yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. Like you say, that we sometimes we don't give ourselves that chance to find out necessarily
Yeah,
as to whether it's true. But if we're facing this unknown, what does it mean for us to become well? We might be scared of our own abilities to perhaps achieve it. If you're worried about, okay, for me to take the next step, for me to become well, I'm going to have to be operating in a full-time position. If that's something that you decide is important to you,
yeah,
you're going to be facing extra questions like, what if I can't cope with it?
yeah,
What if I'm not going to make a success of this?
yeah,
And it comes back to what Tina shared earlier, that we might then get to a place where we make, again, and it's a decision, because it is a decision,
mm,
that we might not even try. And that's, again, it's a normal cycle to be in, and we can be there for a long time. I would like to just give everybody a reminder at this point. I know we actually forgot to do this at the start, and it is important, but we are, of course, operating on a public platform. And what that means is that any comments will be visible to anybody who would like to join us, whether that's through YouTube or our public Facebook page. But of course, I will reiterate this, anything that you are comfortable sharing, please do. We're all about that. Right, so on that note, if we pop over to the next question, or the next header rather. Oh,
oh,
oh, that's a big one.
mm.
Fear of taking responsibility. Neil, what responsibilities do you think we might have fears around?
There's a lot of responsibilities that actually you have to face. You have to be you're responsible for your own self, in terms of you have to be responsible for being you, being authentic, being real to yourself. There's so many things that you need to just be responsible for. You need to be responsible at times of having to deal with upsets, things that challenge you, things that you might pull out of. You have to just take responsibility of yourself,
Yeah,
for me.
I think that's huge. Yourself in your entirety, and this is the thing: when you start to become well, you have to take responsibility for self care.
Yeah,
So making sure that you're staying on top of your routine, you're looking after yourself. You also have to take responsibility for maintenance effectively as well. Mental health is not linear. Mental health and taking good care of it is not easy. It's hard work. And it requires constant communication with friends, people, whoever it may be. It might require doing exercise, being in certain places at a certain time. And that is a responsibility that all of us have to shoulder. If we're talking about some of the things that we might need to do in order to get well as well, being responsible for our own finances,
yeah,
debt, housing, being responsible for navigating successfully really healthy relationships as well. And again, if we actually have to acknowledge the the fact that in order for us to become well, we have to take on more workload.
Yep.
Again, it's a massive dissuader. It will potentially in itself be enough to keep us in that place of feeling
Mm.
unwell as well. But yeah, anybody who's got any fear of taking responsibilities or recognizing that in themselves and their lives, it is absolutely a valid reason and also a reason that potentially can keep us unwell. I don't know if I'm going to go out too far on this one, Neil. I'm going to take a risk on this one.
Mm.
But I know that in order for a lot of people to feel like they're accomplished, feel better in their mental health, accessing volunteer opportunities or accessing work can be a thing. And I've heard it several times before, quite a few times actually, from people in the wider community who are fearful about taking some of these steps because they're worried that, well, they're not going to be able to cope, but they're scared again of taking this responsibility. What I've found though is that a lot of people spend more time worrying about getting their next sick note than actually concentrating on not needing it anymore. And I think that this fear here, the fear of taking responsibility,
Mm.
potentially is one of the biggest reasons that people put more of their energy again into just a continuation of where they're at, focusing on their next sick note, rather than taking the steps so they never need a sick note again.
That's a really interesting point. I like the fact that you
Or
did it, around things like that, because these are sometimes they can be quite common things that people struggle with. And I kind of get the feeling sometimes that because we have that fear around being enough, going back to that comment a little bit earlier, when we then start to get the realization of taking responsibility, it's almost like we can then quite easily deviate back to things rather than focusing on the thing that is stopping us. I love the way you used the kind of sickness analogy. I've had a few people that, just come to mind that use very much the same kind of mechanisms because they don't want to have the whole responsibility of being themselves.
hmm,
Yeah. So if they're fearful of something maybe not going right, then they will sometimes they can deviate to using some kind of vehicle to then stop themselves.
it's absolutely true. It is, isn't it? And I just had a penny drop moment about 30 seconds ago. And I remember vividly when I was at university, one of my dear close friends at the time, who was also struggling with their mental health, said one day, they said to me, Charlie, if I could be paid for being ill, that is to say that I turned up to work, I caught a cold, I had the flu for 8 hours and then it went away, I'd do that.
Mm.
And it's a really
Without actually.
interesting comment. It's a really interesting comment. And
Mm.
actually, I was unwell at the time as well. And I found myself thinking, oh, yeah, that'll be all right.
Mm.
But the reason, now that I see it back, the reason that my friend was saying that is because they perhaps had the mindset that to actually progress, to actually go for a job, I'm glad to say they have now progressed in their well-being and they're a lot better in themselves. But potentially it was a fear of making those changes, taking
Yeah,
responsibility. And it starts to affect the way that we see ourselves and interact with the world.
absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever shared that with
You
you before, but
haven't,
it's an
no.
interesting one. It is. Anyway, we digress. If we shall move on to another one of the big fears that we have, the fear of relationships. And in particular, I don't think we're talking about perhaps negative, damaging relationships or toxic relationships, but the fear of having to navigate healthy relationships. I think it's a hard truth that a lot of us will come to in our own time, but a lot of us will have the realization that fundamentally, as humans, we're social creatures. And as much as we might spend a lot of the time convincing ourselves otherwise that we don't need to have good people in our lives, that we don't need to have social connections, fundamentally we do. And I'm a strong believer of this. I think you are as well,
I
Neil, that
absolutely am. Yes.
everybody needs at least one good, trusting, open relationship in their lives so they can feel a part of something, feel that sense of belonging, feel that they are heard and understood, and share their concerns. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, especially if we're in toxic relationships, we can have a fear around creating healthy relationships. It's kind of two sides to the equation. Sometimes in becoming well, we realize that we need to cut people out of our lives.
Hmm.
I'm sure that this was the case for you as well.
Yes.
And I know that when I was a part of the drug circles that I used to be in, I had to make some very hard decisions as to who I was going to allow into my life and who I wasn't. I had to make some changes. I had to learn to assert my boundaries. And that in itself is terrifying, because we'll all know this, but if we start to stick up for ourselves, like you were saying earlier, some people might not expect it to start
Hmm.
with, Neil. That might cause conflict.
Yeah.
And that's a scary thing in its own right as well. I know that for me, I had to make some positive changes, and I did eventually learn to assert myself. I told my friends, look, if I'm going to hang out with you, I'm not going to be doing drugs anymore. This isn't a thing that interests me. I have to get past this. And what I found is that I lost some friends along the way. But this is the nice thing. For the friends that I still have who are a part of that community, a part of the drug circles, the ones that accepted that change and were happy to meet up with me outside of doing that kind of thing, they're some of my best friends still today, because they're the ones that ultimately are good for you.
Absolutely. And, just taking a couple of points that Charlie's mentioned there, I think, on the road to recovery, fear of relationships, we had to make some conscious decisions. And those people, those toxic people, or those people that were creating a lot of my unwellness, I kind of got rid of. But in terms of that allowed me to become more in control of actually building my social circle, um, with the people that actually are my kind of people. They don't drain me from anything more. Yep, they actually create different things for me. They make me feel loved, and they make me feel like I'm part of something. And in terms of, you know, let's just talk about intimate relationships for a minute.
Mm.
When you kind of are coming out of unwellness, for argument's sake, and I've had this experience myself, there was plenty of time when you that doesn't come on your radar for quite a period of time, but then you get a realization. It's a bit like Charlie said. We're all, you know, we all have to have a relationship of some sort, whether it be friends, whether it be intimate, wherever it might be. And when you start to become well, you have a fear of actually building anything more than outside of your social circle. But there are elements that you discover that you kind of do miss, because we are human beings. We need certain things in our lives. And there was a big fear around taking steps like that, bringing people back in that really meant things to me, and then actually discovering that there's other elements of that where you want to get people to come back in, but then you start thinking, hang on a minute, is this going to be good for me? Is it going to be bad for me? Is it going to create something? So kind of rebuild relationships of especially people that are important in your life is really, really difficult. I'd just share a really quick story in terms of when I was unwell, and this was really kind of a subconscious thing. I kind of didn't want a relationship with some of my siblings, purely because, first of all, I didn't really know what I wanted to discuss or anything like that. And then I had a realization that I needed to get those relationships back in. And I was very, very fearful of bringing that back in, because, again, it goes back to the fear of the unknown.
Mm.
Are they going to be the same person, um, that they were before I actually became the authentic Neil? I'm a different, completely different person, if that's making sense.
Are they going to accept me?
Are they going to accept me? And it's all those kind of areas. Thankfully now I've managed to bring those kind of peoples back in, because, believe it or not, when we're talking about things like acceptance, now I've accepted me as me. There's so many people that actually accept that as well. So I was kind of blocking myself, thinking that their viewpoint is going to be completely different. Reality of it is, it's not,
So
in many respects.
you're absolutely right, Neil. And ultimately, we need to trust ourselves to be authentic, to
Mm,
take some risks, to take some steps. And what we will find in time is that the people that match our energy, the people that match who we are, they stick around. They like you for who you are. They're good people to have in your lives. And the people that aren't suited to you, whether that's just in the moment or potentially into
mm.
the future as well, they will start to drop away. But that starts a whole positive, virtuous cycle where you start to join communities of people that are progressive, that are forward thinking, that have commonality, that are like minded with you. And that's also a huge part of what it means to become well. Finding your tribe,
Yep.
as somebody told me recently. I love
Finding
it.
your tribe. I
Finding
like
your
that.
tribe. It's a
Yeah.
good one, isn't it? We need to find our tribe, and we do need to learn to build healthy relationships. So if we move on, we shall see that we have fear of facing our emotions and stopping old unhealthy coping strategies. So, just to introduce this one here, I think a lot of us will recognize that when we start to become unwell, we fall into certain patterns, and unfortunately, a part of those patterns as well can involve us doing certain actions, certain behaviors that help us to, in the moment, people might say self medicate or minimize some of the emotions that we're feeling. What we're talking about here is any kind of activity which brings immediate gratification, but at the cost of us not being able to feel our emotions there in the moment. These are the kind of things that either mask, numb, suppress, or attempt to control our
Hmm.
emotions. And of course, I'm talking about things like drink, drugs. I'm talking not just about that, though. I'm talking about promiscuity, gambling, excessive gaming, oversleeping, talking about over or under eating comes into it as well. Self harm would certainly be something that features
Hmm.
on this list as well. And there is a whole host of things that any of us can find ourselves doing that ultimately might help, like they help us to manage perhaps our emotions in the moment through a bit of escapism, but ultimately they don't resolve the underlying issue.
No.
Our emotions are still there. And we might find ourselves perhaps a few hours later or a few days later getting back to that place where we have to confront a whole host of painful feelings and choosing to duck out and avoid them. I think that there is, well, probably by its very definition, there is no greater fear than having to feel our emotions, because a lot of the reasons that we struggle with mental health is because we feel overwhelming, painful emotions.
Yes.
But it's almost an unavoidable fact, the more that we suppress our emotions, it doesn't deal with the issue. They don't go anywhere. If anything, they stagnate, they fester, and they will pop up their heads a little bit further down the line, perhaps at a time or place that's completely inappropriate and doesn't suit us. There is an analogy that I was given. This is actually by somebody that we had the pleasure of working with a little while ago. And they described themselves as somebody that spent a long time using unhealthy coping strategies, avoiding the issues, avoiding their emotions. And they described themselves as almost like a closed box, if you will. And they said that it felt like they were on a train coasting across a beautiful countryside, flat villages, forests. And he said that at some point in the future, he didn't know when, his train was going to plow straight into the side of a mountain. And that's because he had the realization, I think a lot of us do, that in order for us to become well, we have to get in tune with our feelings, soothe them in a productive way so that we can move through them rather than resist and exaggerate them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I think there's a number of people, wouldn't you agree, that kind of certainly suppress their emotions. But then there is, to be fair, it's changing now, Charlie, but there is a lot of stigma around some mental health concerns as well. I'm just going to put it out there. It's not something you need to answer, guys, but how many times previously, if you heard the phrase, don't cry, especially from a male point of view, don't cry because it shows weakness. It shows kind of man up kind of situation, and that in turn makes us suppress our emotions. And a kind of realization that I had, without a doubt, but until you actually kind of accept that that emotion is going to happen and feel that emotion, yeah, and then kind of work with it rather than going back a bit, like you said, into some of these unhealthy coping strategies. It could be simple things like gaming.
Mm,
You're feeling sad, you're feeling something, and then to actually get that sense of grounding or whatever it might be, you turn to that. So every time that emotion comes, especially if you're suppressing it, hiding it, masking it, and you go straight back to that, it's kind of the phrase I use quite often is what we resist persists.
persists.
And
Spot on with
until
that.
you reach the point of saying, well, hang on a minute, I can't resist this anymore. I'm going to have to feel this for a point in time and let that emotion flow rather than actually going back into some unhealthy coping strategies.
That's it. And it's one of the mottos of one of our colleagues here, funnily enough, who likes to say crying is the same as breathing. We need to allow ourselves to do it. And we need to
Exactly.
work through that stigma to actually recognize that it's all right to feel emotional.
Yeah.
And if anything, being able to show it in appropriate ways and to deal with it and to allow ourselves to experience it has to be a part of the package. So, guys, I'm aware that we're coming up to the hour. And what that means is that unfortunately, we're going to have to get to the point where we're leaving it here for today. I will say that today we've put a particular focus on, of course, looking at some of the really big obstacles and the big fears that we're going to face on our path to getting well. And in particular today, we haven't put so much emphasis on what can we do to alleviate these fears. What is it that we can do to work through them to get to that place of wellness? But I would like to reassure you that if you are interested in the solutions, or if you're interested in some of the things that we can do, we are direct access now. So that means that if there's, for any reason, you would like a little bit of support, you can feel free to give us a call, and we're very, very happy to accept you. It is worth mentioning as well that we've got a huge variety, a plethora of different topic videos as well that are available not only on our Facebook group, you can revisit the lives from days gone past, but also on our YouTube channel, where we have a beautiful playlist that kind of covers some of the workshop materials that we like to do, but also a load of the topic videos. So please, 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 if you would like to, I would encourage you all to go to YouTube, check out Isorropia Foundation, and start to explore some of the content, because we've been here for an hour, but we have done far more than just this hour.
Yes.
So what I will say on that note, it has been a pleasure. Please, please join us next week as well, when we're going to be looking at the next topic we've got in line for you guys. And otherwise, take care, and we'll see you both soon. We'll see you all
We'll
soon.
see you all soon.
See you later.
Bye bye.